Settlers versus Indians, the Widow Scraggs story, 1787. What drives a mother to abandon her own child to certain death on this haunting April night in 1787? One frontier family faced impossible choices that would echo through generations. Subscribe to Native Legends and History Stories for more untold tales from America's bloody borderlands. The wooden walls of the Scraggs family cabin stood silent against the darkness of Bourbon County's wilderness on April 11, 1787, while delegates gathered in Philadelphia to shape a new nation. This remote outpost of Virginia's Kentucky Territory would become a battleground where survival demanded the most terrible sacrifices. The double cabin's rough-hewn logs bore the marks of hasty construction, typical of frontier settlements pushing ever westward beyond the Ohio River. In the eastern room, 47-year-old Widow Scraggs shared the cramped space with her two grown sons, their rifles never far from reach. Her widowed daughter occupied a corner, nursing an infant whose quiet breaths mingled with the crackling hearth. The western room housed her three daughters, two unmarried girls between 16 and 20 years old, their nimble fingers skilled at the loom, and a half-grown child whose laughter still brightened these dangerous borderlands. Moonlight filtered through the cabin's few windows, casting long shadows across the packed earth floor. At the loom, 19-year-old Sarah's hands moved rhythmically across the warp and weft the shuttle's steady click, of familiar comfort in the late hour. Her younger sister Mary, 16, had already retired to her straw mattress, while 12-year-old Emma curled beneath a worn quilt nearby in the main room. The widow's eldest son James kept watch, his trained ear attuned to the night's ordinary sounds, the crackle of the dying fire, the whisper of wind through chinks in the walls, the occasional shuffle of sleeping bodies. Outside, 4 horses stamped restlessly in their crude enclosure 20 paces from the cabin's door. The pound split-rail fence cast zebra-striped shadows across their flanks. The spring night air carried a bitter chill, and frost crystallized on the newly sprouted grass. The forest pressed close massive oaks and maples, whose branches reached like grasping fingers toward the isolated homestead. The first warning came at 11 o'clock. James noticed the horses' behavior changing, not their usual nighttime restlessness, but something more urgent. Their hooves drummed against the frozen earth as they circled the enclosure, nostrils flaring. Then came the owl's calls echoing through the timber. One cry from the north was answered by another. To the south, then east, then west. The pattern was too precise. Too measured. James's hand crept toward his rifle. Having lived 15 years on the frontier, these settlers knew the language of survival. Every unusual sound could herald death. The Widow Scraggs had buried her husband 3 winters past after a Shawnee raid. To neighboring families had fled east last summer after finding their cattle slaughtered. Though Indian attacks had grown less frequent, south of the Ohio the threat never truly vanished. The horses' panic escalated. Their terrified whinnies pierced the night as they crashed against the fence rails. James rose from his chair by the fire. Muscles tense, a new sound reached his ears. Soft footfalls in the packed earth outside, almost imperceptible beneath the horses' commotion. Then came the knock. Hello. The house, a voice called in. Careful English travelers seeking shelter. James stepped toward the heavy oak door, fingers reaching for the bar. But his mother's voice cut through the darkness like a whip stop. The widow was already out of bed, her feet hitting the floor with practiced silence. 20 years of frontier life had honed her instincts. In the strangers to careful pronunciation, she heard death knocking Indians. She hissed, already moving to wake her younger son. Thomas, get your brother. Guns now. The young men needed no further urging. They drilled for this since childhood. 2 long rifles came smoothly off their pegs, already loaded and primed. The familiar weight of steel and walnut steadied their hands as they took up positions at the gun ports. Narrow slits carved through the logs for just this purpose. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Outside, the travelers waited. Inside, the family held their breath. The widow's daughter clutched her infant closer, stifling its whimpers against her breast. In the other room, the loom's clicking had ceased when the attack came. It exploded with sudden violence, The door shuddered under tremendous impact, not knocking now but the crash of multiple shoulders. Attempting to break through. The bar held, but the entire wall seemed to shake. Through his gun port James glimpsed movement, dark shapes darting through moonlight. A single shot cracked from Thomas's rifle. The muzzle flash briefly illuminated an attacker, lurching backward, clutching his shoulder. The assault on the main door ceased as quickly as it had begun. But in the sudden quiet, they heard new sounds from the cabin's other half. The splintering of wood, the screams of the girls. The brothers swung their rifles toward the partition wall, but the angle was impossible. The Indians had found the cabin's weak point. Rail after rail from the horse-pound crashed against the western room's door. The crude iron hinges groaned, warped, and finally gave way with a shriek of tortured metal. Sarah, still at her loom, snatched up her weaving knife as shadows poured through the shattered doorway. The blade caught moonlight as she slashed desperately at the first warrior to reach her. Blood sprayed across her white nightdress as the knife found its mark in his throat. But even as he fell, the tomahawk in his hand completed its arc. Mary and Emma's screams pierced the night as more warriors seized them. The little girl broke free in the chaos, darting past grasping hands and into the yard. But instead of fleeing into the darkness that might have saved her, blind terror drove her in circles around the cabin. "Help, help!" Her shrill voice rose above the chaos. "They're killing my sisters in the main room." James and Thomas surged toward the door, rifles forgotten, in their desperate need to reach their little sister. But their mother moved faster. Her body slammed against the door, blocking their path. In her eyes, they saw the terrible calculation of survival. No, her voice carried the weight of command. "The child is lost. Go out there and we all die for nothing." As if to punctuate her words, Emma's screams reached a terrifying crescendo, then broke off into a wet gurgle. The silence that followed was worse than any sound they'd heard that night. The acrid smell of burning pine filled the night air as flames erupted from the cabin's western wing. Orange tongues licked up the log walls where the three daughters had lived just moments before. Triumphant war cries echoed through the clearing as 8 warriors danced in the firelight, their shadows grotesquely elongated against the burning structure. The heat pressed against the surviving family members' faces as smoke began seeping through the ceiling joints into their room inside the main cabin. The widow Scraggs watched gray tendrils curl down from above, her face illuminated by the growing inferno. The temperature rose steadily as the fire spread across the shared roof. Sweat beaded on their foreheads while they huddled in the rapidly shrinking safe space. The infant's cries grew more insistent as smoke filled its lungs. "We have to run," James whispered, gripping his rifle until his knuckles whitened. "Now while the smoke gives us cover." The widow nodded grimly. They had perhaps 2 minutes before the entire structure would become their tomb. Through gaps in the walls, they could see Indians positioning themselves around the cabin's perimeter, 15 paces apart, waiting for their prey to emerge. No words were needed for the plan. They had drilled for fire countless times. Though never under siege, James would support his mother toward the north corner, where a loose section of fence offered their best chance. Thomas would guard his sister and the baby as they made for the tree line to the south. The smoke would provide some concealment, but the blazing roof turned night into day. In the yard, the widow squared her shoulders, touching each of her children's faces one final time. Her weathered hands lingered on the baby's downy head. Then she nodded. James threw the bar from the door. The rusted hinges screamed as they burst into the yard. The widow ran with surprising speed for her 47 years. Her son close behind. They reached the fence. As the first shots cracked through the night, James boosted his mother toward the stile, his muscles straining for one heartbeat. It seemed they might make it. The volley caught her as she crested the rail. 3 musket balls struck her chest in a tight pattern. The widow's body jerked once, then folded quietly into the frost-covered grass. James had no time to mourn. Pure instinct sent him vaulting the fence in a singular, fluid motion as bullets whined past his ears. His feet found purchase in the frozen earth, and he was running, zigzagging between the massive oaks that might offer protection. On the cabin's far side, Thomas fired rapidly, covering his sister's dash toward the forest. The baby's cries pierced the chaos as they sprinted through patches of moonlight. They made it 30 yards before the warriors reached them. Thomas's rifle boomed once more, dropping the closest pursuer before they closed the distance. The young man's rifle became a club as 5 warriors surrounded him. The weapon's solid walnut stock shattered the first warrior's jaw in an explosion of blood and teeth. A second swing caught another in the temple with a sickening crack. But there were too many. Thomas positioned himself between the attackers and his sister, buying precious seconds with his life. "Run!" he screamed, just before a tomahawk caught him in the shoulder, nearly severing his arm still. He fought even as blows rained down. His sister's footsteps faded into the darkness as his world narrowed to the desperate dance of survival. When the end came, it was quick. A final strike that split his skull to the teeth. Dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor, shades of pink and gold as Colonel Edwards' LED-30 mounted men into the smoking ruins. The cabins remained still smoldered, sending thin tendrils of smoke spiraling into the crisp morning air. They found Thomas's body sprawled in the bloodied grass, his hands still locked around the splintered remains of his rifle. The widow lay as she had fallen, her face peaceful despite the violence of her end. Of the 8 family members who had begun that terrible night, only 3 had survived. James and his sister with her infant. But the tragedy wasn't finished unfolding. As they followed the clearly visible trail left by the retreating war party, the signs told a story of desperate flight. Broken branches, trampled grass, and occasionally dark spots of blood in the fresh snow marked their passage. The trail led east into the mountains, where ancient limestone ridges rose like giants' teeth against the morning sky. The war party moved fast, but encumbered by their prisoner, the second eldest daughter they had taken. Colonel Edwards' men pressed their horses hard, closing the distance yard by yard. The girl's tracks showed she was weakening, stumbling more frequently as the miles passed. Then a new sound joined the thunder of hooves. The baying of a hound that someone had brought along. The dog's excited howls echoed off the mountain sides, shattering the pre-dawn stillness. The pursuing party had no way to silence as it ran ahead, announcing their approach to the fleeing warriors. They found her just minutes later, crumpled in the bloodied snow. The tomahawk was still embedded in her skull, but incredibly a spark of life remained. Her eyes fluttered open as James dismounted and ran to her side. Her hand reached weakly toward him as her lips moved, trying to form words that might help them catch her killers. But the light was already fading from her eyes. James cradled his sister's head, his tears falling onto her face as her final breath escaped in a soft sigh. They had no time to properly bury her. The trail was fresh, and the warriors couldn't have gone far. With grief transforming into cold rage, the party remounted and spurred their horses forward. 20 minutes of hard riding brought them within sight of their quarry. The warriors had taken up position on a narrow ridge, using an old hunter's trick. They darted from tree to tree, whooping and calling to create the illusion of greater numbers. But Colonel Edwards and his men were experienced Indian fighters. They quickly recognized that only 2 warriors remained, a rear guard sacrificing themselves to buy time for their companions' escape. The pursuers dismounted, securing their horses. Before beginning their ascent of the ridge, they moved with practiced coordination, spreading out to flank the Indian position. The first shots exploded across the ridgetop at 50 paces. Return fire from the warriors was accurate but sparse. They were running low on powder. The fight was brief but intense. Both warriors fought to the last, refusing to surrender even when clearly outnumbered. When the smoke cleared, their bodies lay sprawled among the limestone outcrops, their faces set in fierce final defiance. The trail of their companions led deeper into the mountains, but was already growing cold. The main war party had won their escape at the cost of their rear guard's lives. Colonel Edwards called off the pursuit as heavy clouds building in the west threatened snow that would soon obscure any remaining sign. The mounted party turned back toward the settlement, carrying their dead. James rode with his sister's body across his saddle, her blood staining the horse's white flanks crimson. They buried the family together on a small rise overlooking the burnt cabin site, for fresh graves were dug into the frozen earth. The widow Thomas, the eldest daughter who died defending her sisters, and the second daughter whose final moments played out in the blood-stained snow. The surviving sister stood silent, clutching her infant as the first shovelful of dirt fell. That night, as his remaining family slept in a neighbor's cabin, James stood watch at the window. His rifle rested across his knees as he stared into the darkness, listening to the owls calling in the distance. But these were real owls, speaking to the night in their true voices. In a single night, the Scraggs family had paid the bitter price of America's westward expansion in blood and grief and lives cut brutally short. Colonel Edwards split his men into 3 groups of 10 to surround the ridge. The first group approached from the east, using a line of mature oaks for cover. The second group circled west through a ravine, while the third held position with the horses. At 40 paces, the first shots rang out. The Indian warrior dropped instantly when 2 rifle balls struck his chest. His companion returned fire from behind a limestone outcropping, the musket ball splintering bark inches from Private Johnson's head. Blood already stained the warrior's wool blanket dark red where a previous shot had caught him in the side. Despite his wound, the warrior's movements showed years of combat experience. He fired and relocated with practiced precision, never presenting a clear target for more than a second. His shots forced the pursuers to waste precious minutes, finding new cover. Each careful shot from his rifle found its mark within inches of the soldiers, pinning them down while using minimal ammunition. The pursuit stretched over for miles of broken ground. The warrior led them through a series of switchbacks, doubling back multiple times to confuse his trail. He took advantage of every piece of cover: massive boulders, fallen logs, deep ravines. The snow recorded his path in drops of blood, growing larger and more frequent as the chase continued. Private Williams caught a glimpse of him moving between rocks at 60 yards. His shot caught the warrior's leg, producing a fresh spray of blood across the snow. Still, the wounded man pressed on, though his pace had slowed considerably. The blood trail showed where he had stopped to bind his wounds, with strips torn from his blanket. 2 hours into the pursuit, the warrior's tactical skill became clear. He had drawn the soldiers miles off his companion's escape route, up into terrain where horses struggled to follow. Each time, the pursuers thought they had him cornered. He found another path through the rocks. His knowledge of the landscape proved superior to their greater numbers. The chase led them higher into the mountains, where patches of old snow lingered in shadowed hollows. The warrior's blood marked his failing strength. Places where he had stumbled or braced himself against trees were clearly visible. Yet each time they closed within 50 yards, he managed another burst of speed. At midday, they tracked him to a swift stream, cutting through a narrow valley. The water ran 3 feet deep over smooth rocks, fed by mountain snow melt. The warrior's tracks led directly into the icy current. For 30 minutes, groups searched both banks, a half-mile upstream and down, but found no sign of emergence. Colonel Edwards ordered a wider search. 20 men spread out in pairs, checking every cave and hollow within 500 yards of the stream. They found nothing: no tracks, no blood trails, no broken branches. The warrior had vanished completely. Dark clouds building over the western peaks forced a decision. Already snowflakes were beginning to fall, the first few flutters quickly becoming a steady curtain of white. Within an hour, any remaining signs would be completely obscured. Colonel Edwards called off the search as darkness approached. The next morning revealed a transformed landscape. 6 inches of fresh snow buried every trace of the previous day's pursuit. The wounded warrior's ultimate fate remained a mystery that the wilderness would keep. His tactical retreat had successfully scattered the pursuit force and delayed them long enough for the main war party to make good their escape. The remains of the first warrior were buried where he fell, his weapons and possessions left intact. In recognition of his courage, the pursuing party gathered their horses and began the long ride back to the settlement. In their saddlebags, they carried confirmation that frontiersmen weren't the only ones willing to die protecting their people. Back in Bourbon County, the attack's impact spread quickly through the scattered homesteads. Within a week, 12 families had improved their defenses. They reinforced cabin walls with extra thickness, added firing ports at strategic points, and constructed stronger door bars. 3 families who had been considering settling further west changed their plans, choosing instead to build closer to established communities. The Scraggs cabin site stood as a grim reminder. 5 fresh graves marked the family's loss. The widow Thomas, the eldest daughter who died fighting, the second daughter killed in the snow, and the little girl who ran screaming into the night. James and his surviving sister rebuilt on a new site, 2 miles closer to the main settlement, this time with the help of 15 neighbors, who spent for days raising thick walls and a defensible roof. Hunting parties over the next month found no sign of the war party's main group. They had vanished into the vast territory north of the Ohio River, leaving only questions about their origin and motivation. Some speculated they were Shawnee. Others thought they recognized Ottawa, wore paint and weapons. The truth disappeared with them into the wilderness. The story spread through the Kentucky Territory over the following years, each telling emphasized different aspects. The widow's terrible choice to abandon her youngest, the eldest daughter's fierce resistance with her weaving knife, Thomas's last stand, buying time for his sister's escape. Families used the account to teach their children the price of carelessness on the frontier. In Bourbon County itself, the attack's memory remained fresh for decades. New settlers arriving in the area heard the story within days of choosing their home sites. The details served as a checklist for cabin defense: the importance of strong doors, the need for overlapping fields of fire, the danger of separated living spaces that couldn't support each other. The Scraggs family survivors carried their own burdens. James never married, devoting himself instead to helping maintain the settlement's defenses. His sister raised her child among neighbors who had witnessed their loss. The infant growing up with the story of that night as part of his heritage, their personal tragedy, became part of the larger tapestry of Kentucky's transformation from wilderness to settled land. They were not the first family to pay such a price, nor would they be the last. The Kentucky frontier in 1787 stood at the intersection of colliding worlds, one pushing westward with settlements and farms, the other fighting to preserve hunting grounds and traditional ways of life. The Scraggs family story captured a moment in that larger struggle, preserved through the survival of James and his sister to witness and remember. Between the Ohio River and the Cumberland Gap, countless stories of courage and loss shaped America's frontier experience. These voices from our shared past deserve to be heard. Subscribe to Native Legends and History Stories to discover more forgotten chapters of America's untold history.